All right, let's check if I'm in fact live. Because we can't trust websites, can we? Let me see. Is it starting? Okay. Huh. Oh yeah, I can hear myself. That's good. I assume that means you can hear me too, and possibly even see me. So, welcome to, was it Thursday, the 12th of December? We're going to do the same thing as usual, which means, breakfast sprinting, drinking tea, talking a bit about stuff, and then trying to, get shit done, which is sometimes harder than you might think. Well, I mean, I assume that if you're watching these streams, you know that it's kind of hard to get shit done, but we're trying. Yo, Britain! Oh, so in Florida is where you went to. I was asking you yesterday, and then you were already gone by the time I saw that. So, how is Florida? I assume it's warm and humid and stuff. That is good, Britain. That is very good. Hooray, Apollo! How you doing? Britain, how was your flight? I hope it was good, and I hope you have settled in. Are you there visiting family, or what brought you to that specific part of the United States? Just out of curiosity, if you don't mind. I need to decide what to read next because I did, in fact, finish Vengeance is Mine by, Will Turley and, Richard E. Turley and Barbara Jones Brown with the aftermath of the Mountain Meadows Massacre yesterday. And now I need to figure out what to read next. And I am somewhat stumped. But I need to figure out what audiobook to listen to at the gym later. And I've been thinking about it. And there is, of course, me re-listening to Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner, which is the kind of book that is definitely depressing and really long and more nonfiction. And I do have The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro, and that is obviously something Arthur related. So I kind of feel the need to have read it at some point. And I have the first Redwall book because, I'm going to make videos on Redwall over Christmas, and I can listen to that. The audiobooks for Redwall are so funny. I'm like, if you have an Audible account, most of them seem to be free right now, which is really cool for me because it saves me money. Most of them are free. And Redwall is this technically children's books about lots of animals living in like a medieval monastery and around that medieval Redwall monastery and having adventures and stuff. But they get pretty medieval at some time, right? The first one is about Redwall Abbey being besieged by rats, I think. And they do pour like boiling oil down the sewers to burn like the attackers and stuff. So it gets pretty realistic, only that it's all animals. So yeah, there's that, and the audiobooks are narrated by the author, by Brian Jack. I would say Jack, but the audiobook says Brian Jakes, and I'm like, that's probably just Americans not knowing how to pronounce French, but who knows? Anyway, and he has like a very sort of like late 80s, early 90s, like theatrical performance of like when he's reading, and it's the slightly rolled R and over pronouncing everything. It's wonderful. It adds to the very, very specific sort of like children's book nostalgia, kind of almost like children's radio plays kind of nostalgia for it, which is really cool. But yeah, well. So I could listen to that, or I could check out some William S. Burroughs, because right now a lot of William S. Burroughs books are currently part of the free program on Audible, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that reading more William S. Burroughs is definitely helping my sanity. It certainly worked for Naked Lunch, which is one of those books that are really interesting to read. Nice. I was not aware that so much of what I recommend was also free. Here's a funny thing when we're talking about the science fiction I recommended. Neuromancer being one of the sort of like, the big cyberpunk novels, and even the stuff that Gibson wrote before. There's a really interesting interview, like an early interview with William Gibson, where he talks about that he didn't know anything about actual digital technology when he started writing cyberpunk, and that he was attending like a conference, science fiction conference, and there were like other there were like IT people there at the hotel as well, and he was sort of like listening into an IT nerd conversation at the late 70s, early 80s, and didn't understand anything. And what he did read at the time was a lot of beat stuff, Kerouac and Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs. And what he tried when he was writing about digital technology, especially the Matrix stuff in the early, in the very early sprawl stuff, was trying to recreate the sort of like stream of consciousness, weird change word association stuff that a lot of beat stuff, in particular Burroughs, does in books like Naked Lunch, trying to take those sort of like word chains and just replace, but use like different sort of like tech terminology instead of drug terminology to create a feeling of this feeling of rush that he kind of wanted to use and wanted to create for the reader when Case is logging into a chair, is plugging into the Matrix, or well, cyberspace, and I find that like really interesting as an idea. When you once I read Gibson way before I read Burroughs for the first time, but knowing that detail about where he comes from, you can see a lot of that sort of like beat influence in William Gibson's early work. Not so much in the later stuff, which is different, but very interesting. I mean, I didn't like The Peripheral that much. I mean, it's an interesting concept, and I should probably reread it, see if I get more out of it now. I do really appreciate his sort of early 2000s trilogy. I don't even know what it's called. It has like Spook Country, Pattern Recognition. Now, Pattern Recognition is the first, and then it's Spook Country and Zero History. And they're sort of like very, very near future books, usually about people being hired by this Belgian billionaire to sort of research stuff for his weird magazine kind of thing. It's very early 2000s internet culture in a lot of ways, and they have to look up sort of fringe art styles and stuff like that, and he kind of goes from there to like a larger thought process on like where society is and what a society is doing. And that's like the other thing that William Gibson is so good at, is like, if you use any social networks these days, any social media platforms, find William Gibson's account and follow William Gibson. He's usually at Great Dismal, and that's his usual handle. And just look at what William Gibson is looking at, because usually he's incredibly good at finding sort of like fringe art stuff, fringe art, sort of these movements where art and technology kind of overlap, just like really weird shit. And he's really good at finding that stuff and sharing it. And you can usually learn a lot about like where society is going. And that's like his strength as an artist, as a writer, is to find sort of these ideas. And like in like 2001 or whenever Pattern Recognition came out, right? He talked about this movement that it augmented reality art, where they basically created art objects in, in cyberspace, like geotagged and whatever. I mean, that was 2001, 2002. Like technology wasn't, where it is now, but he was basically, we have these things, and and people who want to see that art kind of can pay us something, and then they can see that through either AR goggles or like through their phones or whatever. And we can use that for political means as well, because we have suddenly like tags and graffitis that only those who know where they are can find them, basically through technology. And that was like the early 2000s, and I'm like, yeah, that's, that's realistic stuff compared to, say, Neil Stephenson's view of cyberspace of the metaverse in Snow Crash, which is obviously really cool, which is why everyone wants to recreate it, but it's also not exactly practicable. Yeah, I don't know if I would call it sad. And I mean, I would not take William Burroughs as as any form of role model, because yeah, turns out heavy drug addiction, especially when we're talking about heroin and shit like that, it's not a good thing. It'll definitely fuck up your life in all kinds of ways, and that's sort of what you can see with Burroughs and him. And that's something that I found interesting in Naked Lunch, especially if you have like the newer edition that has like a lot of like additional scenes, cut scenes, and letters and stuff like that, where he talks about yeah, once again, like the struggle with addiction and how addiction is often sort of like tied to sort of like the interests of society, right? There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with William S. Burroughs. But yeah, not exactly the kind of person I would, like to make like a role model. So I'm not sure I'm sad that there's not as many authors like that anymore, because there's a danger in idolizing artists that live these larger than life sort of existences. I mean, up to a point, and I'm only touching on that quickly, right? Like up to a point, that's kind of what people did with Cormac McCarthy, right? And there's a danger in that, because once everyone tells you you're like out there and like special or unique or whatever, it's easy to believe that and act in ways that actually harm others, whether it's, playing William Tell with your wife and killing your wife accidentally, or doing the things that Cormac McCarthy did. And I mean, David Foster Wallace is another good example of an artist that has been sort of like idolized by thousands of people, probably millions of people, and who was a very broken person who constantly harmed people around himself. And that's, that's not something to celebrate. And that whole tortured artist cliche, I think, has done a lot of harm. And there's probably sort of like I mean, there's a societal part to this, right? Where we sit out here and in our small rooms and we live our small lives, and um, most of us are not necessarily happy with the system that we live under, because being just a cog in the machine of capitalism is not necessarily fun, right? And then we see these people do all these crazy things, and on the one hand it's dangerous, and then it's also like obviously harmful to a lot of people, but it's easy to sort of like project a lot of like the things we wish we could do, or our sort of like acknowledgement that we are heavily restricted in the things that we can or cannot do, or at least we think we are heavily restricted. Like, I mean, I would argue that there's a lot of stuff that is technically possible. We just don't do that because we have not only the rigid laws that are actually written down, but we also have like societal sort of norms and shit that we don't necessarily need to adhere to, right? And it's easy to sort of project that sort of unhappiness or frustration with these both written and unwritten rules of society, and just idolize people who are objectively living outside of those rules in a way, and then go like, well, you can only create this good art, great art or unique art if you are that unique of a person, and if you do all these fucked up things at the same time, that's not how that works. I mean, there may be things that are only accessible up to a point if you are in a specific mental condition. I mean, I would argue it's why it's very difficult for for example, bands who make, hardcore punk rock music, whatever, that kind of stuff, or black metal is another very extreme kind of genre, right? It's very difficult to keep the things that make such bands like early records so emotionally charged. It's very difficult for bands to recapture that once they're older because, yeah, if you're 15 and angry at the world, the art that you will create is art that is angry at the world in a lot of ways, or it somehow transports that anger. But if you are like in your mid 40s and you're married and you have children and you live a relatively comfortable life, you can't necessarily recapture that specific anger. You can find new ways to be, still frustrated with the world, because even if you have a fairly comfortable life, you can still look outside your window and go like, well, I may be pretty well off, but the rest of the world is still burning, and you can find ways to do that. But it takes it makes a difference, and it may mean that your art that you're creating at that point is no longer as accessible, or does no longer speak to the same people that your early records speak to, possibly because they are now young, angry, and 15, and don't want to hear you talk about whatever you're talking about now, or possibly because they have grown old like you and have not necessarily made the same changes in personality that you have. And that's certainly something to be kept in mind. But I feel like there is a danger with idolizing sort of like the with the idolizing of the sort of like tortured artist stereotype, and especially how it often is connected to sort of like these great genius artists who are usually dudes, and then behave, engage in some pretty heinous behavior over time. Yeah, definitely. Like Burroughs is fearless, but a lot of that fearlessness, I think, also comes from the feeling that you have nothing left. All right, that there is nothing more to fear because you're already so down low, and that's not necessarily a place you want to be in. But I would agree. It's certainly fearless in a lot of ways, which is good, I guess. All right, shall we do the thing, right, where we pretend to be productive? I have like a couple of comments and stuff to get to. I will try to be back at somewhere between 9 and 9:05. Should you go to bed because you have been up since 4 a.m., Britain, I do wish you a good night. Should you try to read some more, then I don't know, read some and let me know what you're reading at the moment. I assume it's not Burroughs. And I am back. How are you guys doing? I hope you had a productive 40 something ish minutes. So yeah, I don't know about the phone. I mean, there's no sun. There is truly very little sun in Germany. It's just I've had this phone for 5 years, I guess, almost 5 years at this point. And I've had the phone case for something like 5 years as well. And if you use that phone every day, you carry it to festivals, which may be in the sun or may not be in the sun, but certainly are it can be somewhat dirty and stuff. It does, you know, uh, take its toll, I guess. So that's why it looks that way. But then, I mean, I can't afford a new phone anytime soon, so I hope it will keep a bit longer and doesn't break anytime soon. I mean, it broke earlier this year, but it was only the plug, so I could have that replaced quickly. And hey, Kale, I forgot to say that, yes. Hey, Jan, how you doing? So yeah, I did the things that I planned to do during the first sprint, which is reading the news, reading emails, reading comments, commenting back, replying to comments, pressing like buttons, that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's one of those things where I, uh, you know, have to realize that it's part of the whole doing YouTube stuff that you kind of have to also reply and read and so forth. And yeah, I did that. I don't remember if I said that earlier today, but I did get a message from YouTube this morning that apparently that yeah, it's the fourth anniversary of this channel. I did upload my first video on, I guess, the 12th of December, 2020. Holy shit! Oh, I assume. Which Quicksilver do you mean by that? Because I know there's some Quicksilver apparently on Book Talk right now that I have obviously no idea what it is about because I only see the YouTube videos of YouTubers complaining about the newest Book Talk thing, and then I never click on it because why the fuck would I? And there is, of course, Quicksilver being the first novel in Neil Stephenson's Baroque cycle, which one this one I have read, and I think it's a really fun book. Um, especially since it's mostly about mathematics, I guess. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? I could use a different, cheaper smartphone, but the assistive technology, like the screen reader stuff, is not as good on Android phones as it is on an iPhone. So I stick with the iPhone for now. But luckily, they seem to have really long lives. Like the first one I had for almost 7 years, which is pretty good for a smartphone, I think, compared to some others. When I look at like friends and they go through like 3 or 4 phones at the same time, and I'm like, and like one every 2 years or 3 years maybe, and I'm like, well, this I got this early 2020 and it's still going. So I'll use it as long as it works. Okay, yeah, that sounds like it might be the one that I have seen booktubers complain about. Well, I mean, seen the titles of the videos and not clicked on it. Not the Neil Stephenson one. The Neil Stephenson one I think is also fun. It also is about alchemy, of course, but it's also about Isaac Newton and about Leibniz and the calculus debate and piracy and other important topics, of course. But yeah, so I hope it's good. I'm not big into Fae stuff, reading wise. Read. I don't think I've read much of like current Fae stuff because it's always seems to be targeted at like a very different audience than me personally. I mean, obviously, there's some interesting, Fae or fairy, whatever you want to call it, content in books like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or Blood in the Mist, and books like that. But that's a very different kind of Fae from, say, the Sarah J. Maas Fae, I guess. And it's very difficult to figure out what kind of Fae those will be. But if it's the one that is popular on BookTok, I assume it's more Sarah J. Maas Fae than Blood in the Mist Fae. Which is a shame because more people should read Blood in the Mist. It's a wonderful book. That sounds really good. I really I'm happy that you have found a book that is fun and that is going fast paced. That is often hard to find. In that case, you got lucky, I guess, Apollo. And that's like I think the problem with a lot of technology is that yes, planned obsolescence is of course a real thing, but sometimes it's also like that you can have like a cheap kind of phone or whatever and it works forever, and then you buy the next one and it kind of breaks after like 2 years, and you don't know why because one component kind of broke, and then depending on what it is, then fixing it later is actually more expensive than getting a new one. And I think that both things exist. You have the planned obsolescence stuff where you at some point you don't get any updates for your software anymore and all of that stuff. But on the other hand, you also have just by virtue of having so many different components in modern technology, the chance of one of them breaking is just like incredibly high. As I said, like for me, that was the plug. Luckily, plugs are easy to exchange. If it had been something else, things might have been different. For example, my last camera broke, the one I used for recording videos, and there it was. The thing that broke after like 3 years was actually part of the chipset, and that thing is much harder to to much more expensive to replace than just like the battery or the plug or anything of the sort. So you never quite know what is. It's a bit like gambling, I guess. But then again, most of life is. Yeah, that's like always the question with like, is it romantasy? Is it high fantasy? I don't think I've ever read any actual romantasy, or at least nothing that has been officially marketed as romantasy. But there's probably a bunch of reasons why. One of them is, of course, that I'm a contrarian. When everyone praises a book, I'm like, I'm not going to read that. And on the other hand, me reading, I don't know, say, what's it called, Fourth Wing or Sarah J. Maas, I don't think would work well because I'm not the target audience. I might read one of them just as out of interest, but it's not the kind of book that I have anything like meaningful to add to. And there's already enough like, older dudes on the internet complaining how bad these books are because, there's a market for bashing literature that is mostly marketed towards younger women, and I don't feel like I need to be part of that specific crowd. It always feels mean and yeah, mean spirited mostly to me, and I don't need to be that. mean spirited to begin with, but also feeding in that cycle of misogyny that is obviously still going on. And like, I'd rather not. And it may be that those are not necessarily the most thematically deep novels in the world, but then again, I've read enough books that are marketed towards dudes, and they are also not necessarily thematically deep in any meaningful way. So I don't know. It's a whole complex thing, and I might have to talk about it at some point in detail. But something I not at the moment. Now that's an interesting statement there. But like, if you like more into historical fiction stuff, what kind of historical fiction are you sort of like mostly interested in like which kind of historical era? And yeah, depending on where you move towards fantasy, there is, of course, a lot of trash. I would argue that there's a lot of trash, so to speak, in every genre. That's just like how, publishing works. That's how entertainment works, right? Like, even like your favorite style of music, there will be a lot of bad stuff released in that specific genre. Your favorite, genre of literature, there will be a lot of bad stuff sort of released. And the trick is that over time, this sort of like distorts because you only remember the good stuff and go like, well, look back in the 80s, there were like 3 really good epic fantasy series released. And now there's all that trash. And I'm like, yeah, you're just forgetting that there were like 50 other fantasy series that no one is talking about because they were not, they did not stand out long enough. And that's just the same thing for now. The trick is to sort of understand or make sort of like an educated guess on which kind of books that are published right now may sort of like be those classics, or the things that people remember in like 20 years or 30 years or whatever. And that's sort of like where I would say the trash to high quality kind of ratio usually is more in that, while you're sort of like in the moment, you don't notice the difference because it's just so much, and there's so much being published at the moment in general that it's very difficult to sort of notice that and find a way to pick the stuff that you really want to read and so forth. Um, but I'm pretty sure that's a general genre, not a fantasy problem. It's a general art problem or entertainment problem. I would say it's the culture industry, I guess. Okay, so you're more into the sort of like Edwardian, Victorian kind of stuff historically, I guess. Yeah, that could be. I'm not saying that is not happening, Apollo. I haven't read it. I mean, I did that whole series last year when I read those dark elf books by R.A. Salvatore, which are clearly more targeted towards teenage or young men, and they're not exactly having moral complexity in there either. I think it's a general idea that it's difficult to sort of gauge your audience capacity for complexity when you're dealing with young adults or older children, because I mean, that's sort of like the weird thing there, right? Is that young adult is such a vague kind of thing. It's like it's a marketing term, obviously. So it's like this is marketed to people between say 13 and 18 or 19. I'm like, there's stuff you can do and talk about with 18-year-olds that you can't necessarily talk about with 12-year-olds, and that's normal. But if you bracket that all in the same place, then you can either infantilize the people that are at the upper end of the whole spectrum, or you can overwhelm the people at the younger end of the spectrum. And I guess most people play it safe and rather infantilize people, and that goes beyond just everyone generally infantilizing women, especially younger women, and it's just part of patriarchy, I guess. And in that regard, I think YA does And this, I feel like the interesting thing is that while it does that, there is that second target audience for books that are, marketed towards young women, or YA literature for mostly women in a lot of ways, where you have women in their 20s or 30s or whatever going back and reading these books and celebrating these books potentially as a form of escape from, living as fully as full subjects as adults in a world that kind of sucks. And you go like, well, I'm going to read books that still treat me as if I was a child, because then I don't have to deal with all the misogyny and all the other stuff happening right now. Maybe that's part of it. I wouldn't know, as I am not that kind of person, obviously. I have read the fifth season, yes. And that's exactly the kind of book where I would argue that it is certainly something that people will still read in 20 years or 30 years. I think it's an excellent way of using a lot of fantasy and science fiction tropes and elements and so forth, and then still having something meaningful to say and having something powerful to say and saying it in a passionate and emotional and powerful way. So I think the fifth season, like the whole trilogy, Broken Earth trilogy, does fit that bill of something that I would argue is probably one of the most influential genre fiction books of the last 20 years. I still haven't read Gideon the Ninth. I mean, a lot of people seem to love it, but I haven't tried it yet. And I think that the other thing that, beyond just being good books, the thing that N.K. Jemisin did with specifically the fifth season is that she proved to the publishing industry and like the larger world, I guess, that you can write these kind of books. You can write politically meaningful, powerful, partly queer, feminist, anti-racist, environmentally conscious, and so forth genre fiction, and it does in fact actually sell, and you have an audience for that. There's a marketable audience for that, and that's unfortunately something that we need to always keep in mind when we're dealing with the publishing industry today. It's like, well, they want to sell books. You kind of need to prove to them that the thing you're doing sells. Otherwise, you can go to like a niche publisher or self-publish and do your work there. But if you want to get mainstream publishing, you need to you need to convince people that what you're doing sells, which is hard and fucked up. I think like the whole question, like with world building, and this is me speaking as a very specific, like my personal experience. I would argue that a lot of fantasy, not just YA, and I would not call the fifth season YA. I think it gets pretty dark, just because it has one young adult or child point of view character does not mean it's YA. But I think we have drifted, especially in fantasy, into a sort of mind space where we expect there to be a lot of world building and world building to matter a lot, and where we judge our understanding of a book by how many details we can understand, remember, and connect about the world. And world in this case meaning how many people live there, what's their names, what's the names of different magic bits and pieces, how does all of that function. And I often blame Brandon Sanderson in part for that trend, because he clearly does do that very well. I think it in part also comes from uh, both tabletop role playing games and video games becoming more and more of an influence on fantasy, on genre fiction in general. And games have this element of exploration and learning about the game world you're in, as a core part of where the fun comes from. or used to have. Obviously, games have become more cinematic and story driven over the last years as well. But for a long time, playing tabletop or like video game, like especially fantasy games, RPGs, was a lot about like walking around, learning bits and pieces about the world, picking stuff up about the world, and that I think has seeped into fantasy. I would argue that for like good fantasy, you don't need to remember all the bits about who was king from when to when and how does the magic work and so forth, and understand all the different made up words. You don't need to do that. If the story is actually good and has something to say, then you should be able to sort of understand that or enjoy that without constantly being reminded that you have forgotten that one specific magic element that may come up like every 500 pages. And that I think is a danger that a lot of like contemporary fantasy has certainly slipped into. And obviously, Tolkien being still one of the sort of keystones of the genre has not helped there, because clearly world building was already a big deal there. But I found that really interesting when I read the Siege of Burning Grass recently, because there are bits of world building happening, but they're so far in the background, and it's mostly just about these two characters walking across this war-torn wasteland, basically, and talking to each other and struggling with each other. And it's, yes, they have dinosaurs that also work as apparently fighter planes, I guess, or for aerial combat, but doesn't get explained. It's not necessary to explain that, because the story is very much about the persons going through something. And that is certainly something that I feel more fantasy could get towards. Maybe that's something where romantasy actually does strike a bit of a chord, because romance, by definition, right, is about inner conflict and is about turmoil. And yes, there will be dragons and whatnot around you in your romantasy, but the core conflict is about people falling in love or not falling in love or whatever. And maybe that's why, in that regard, romantasy is a bit of a counter move towards, or an antithesis to, the kind of Brandon Sanderson style 2000s epic fantasy, where suddenly remembering all these details was deemed like an important part of enjoyment. And because that happened at the same time as the internet became more prevalent, and online and fandom moved online, suddenly knowing all these details were part of your fan identity, and were part of like how you can create standing within fan communities. They were like a form of social capital in that regard, right? And that has only made it even worse for people to casually walk into fantasy space, read a book, and go like, well, do I really need to know all of this? And you look online, and everyone tells you, yes, you need to know all of this, and you also need to know this and this and this. And here's also like 5 interviews with the author where they also mention one other detail that is not even in the book, but if you don't remember that, we'll never actually explain anything to you. It's a bit like trying to use Linux for the first time and going online on like an older like Linux help forum and asking a question, everyone being a dick to you because you're not on their level of deep knowledge, specific knowledge. And there is in fact like research that it kind of ties in, or is combined, to fandom becoming more male dominated in that move towards online fandom and so forth, compared to what it was in, say, the 80s and even like early 90s, when it was far more fandom in a lot of ways was far more dominated, or a much more a safer space for different marginalized groups who could sort of like safely explore themselves and their situation in fandom before it was moved towards a more male-dominated space, which it is today. And there are, of course, capitalist reasons for that, because once again, people decided that if we're marketing all of this stuff, right, we want to find the target audience with the most money, and that's white middle-class dudes in their 30s. And that has ruined a lot, I think. The 5th season is the Broken Earth trilogy, is about a far future where the planet has, how to say that? It's about a place that is about to have another apocalypse, basically, and people trying to survive that. And it has an interesting structure in that it has a lot of it is written in second person, which some people find difficult to get into because it's so rarely used, where you as the reader are constantly addressed, and it is partly as if your life story is told to you. And it has like three, I guess, mostly main sort of like elements of one person trying to find her daughter, and then there are parts that are set in the past, and then you also have partly the daughter's point of view, and it deals heavily with racism and environmental topics, and of course misogyny and so forth. And it has a very, very brutal start. Just to be clear, it starts incredibly brutal. Not necessarily with like a lot of graphic, violent detail, but it starts with the death of a child. And if that's something that you find triggering, then you might have a hard start, hard time getting into the fifth season. The second one is the Obelisk Gate, and I think the third one is the Stone Sky, or the other way around. Yeah, they're incredibly good. Hey, Ida. I have not read The Blind Spot. Yes, Jans, Jan, that's part of it, right? There's so many books, and finding the stuff that works for you is so difficult, and I don't know how to do it. I usually stick to authors that I already know I enjoy, and then I look at, sometimes, certain awards kind of work well for me. It's like if something is nominated for or shortlisted for an Ursula Le Guin award, chances are high I'm at least going to enjoy, maybe not enjoy, but certainly get something meaningful out of reading that kind of book. Whereas if something's on the list for the Goodreads Choice Awards, chances are I'm not going to like that. But so much of it, and I think that's partly why BookTube has become such a thing, and partly also BookTok, is that you can find sort of people. If you search for like one book that you already enjoy, and you find people that also enjoyed that book, then you find out what else they enjoy, and you sort of build this understanding with specific other individuals who read other books, where you trust their sort of tastes because they somewhat align with your own, and that helps navigate the insane space full of published books that come out every single day. All right, I got sidetracked a lot here. So let's do like another 45 minutes, and I'll be back around 10:15 in my time space, 9:15 for Ida. I'm gonna try to do the whole productivity thing. I also need to make new tea, so there you go. Good luck with trying to read, or good luck with writing, or making tea, or whatever else it is you do in the morning. And I am back, and hopefully so are you. How are you guys doing? Did you get some reading done? Did you drink some tea? Did you do some writing? Did you, I don't know, make up more songs about your cat, depending on, what you planned for these sprints? I did do a little bit of writing and a little bit of further reading and stuff, and so I guess it's okay. I wish I had been better, but this week I'm really struggling with starting to write, and I don't know why it is, but it's I open the document and I look at it and and then I just need like a while to sort of put actual words in there. Once I start, it kind of works for a while, but it takes a while, and that if I knew how to sort of speed up that process of getting ready, that would be really helpful. Sadly, I don't. So instead, I usually just procrastinate until I can actually force myself to start typing, which is probably not the best approach to all of this. But what can you do? I am loath to answer the question about how many books I read, because I feel the number that Goodreads tells me, I don't think is. Now that sounds really nice, Apollo. That sounds really, really nice. But yeah, so I feel like Goodreads has a very high number standing there, but that is like a lot of nonfiction stuff I read for research purposes, and that's also me having sort of being in a situation where I have enough time to actually do a lot of like audiobook listening and stuff like that. I traveled a lot. I spend a lot of time in trains and whatnot, which is really good time to listen to audiobooks. And so yeah, it's a very high number. But I feel like talking about that always gives people the wrong impressions. Like, oh, I only read like 35 books is a lot of books, right? That's not nothing. That's not like one book for every 2 weeks, or a little less than 2 weeks. That's pretty good, depending on the kind of book you're reading. That's even better. And I think this sort of like focus on how many books have you read this week kind of thing, that stuff like Goodreads with its Goodreads challenge and so forth build, I think, is wrong. As long as you enjoy reading, and as long as you sort of like do the thing that you enjoy more or less continuously when you have the time for it, right? If you read like 2 pages every day, that's cool, right? That's great. And then you have people going like, look, I've read like 500 books this year. And I'm like, yeah, but a lot of these are manga. A lot of these are very, very short. And then you have like tips like how to read another 20 books in December. And it's like, yeah, you can read like books that all have like 50 pages, and that will certainly drive up your number. But at that point, are you enjoying what you're reading, or are you just trying to max out that specific number to then brag about it? And that's not how that should work. So I usually, I put a number in that Goodreads thing, so it stops annoying me whenever I open the site, and then I just continue reading. And when I pass the number, then I pass the number. When I don't pass the number, then I don't pass the number. Speaking of, I still need to decide what to listen to now that I'm going to the gym, and still haven't decided, because I'm really bad at making choices. And maybe I'll just go with the Cadillac Desert, not so much because I really, really want to, but it's a good way to not make a choice, if you know what I mean. I'm like, I know what's in there. I can sort of semi-justify it because parts of it talk about like Mormon settlements in Utah and the form of agriculture they brought there and how that's bad and stuff like that. So it allows me to not make a decision of what book to read next, while still reading a good book, right? I mean, it's the same way that I often do sort of like what I would call productive procrastinating when I do something that I can sort of justify, right? I'm not just watching Netflix. I'm not just, doing any of that. I'm reading, I'm researching something for a new project. And like, yeah, but you could also, just like get to the thing that you really need to do, sort of, but instead you're doing something else and you start new projects. But it's the ADHD thing. What can you do? Slowly overcome it, or find ways to make it actually productive. So yeah, I guess I'd better pack my stuff and head off to the gym. I assume I'll be back tomorrow. I will try to record the video for Lat Luda today. That would be neat. Yeah, that's the point. Like, I mean, there's stuff where I can like last year when I did the Drizzt thing, right? I can read one Dark Elf novel per day because there's not that much to process, and they're all fairly similar. So after a while, you're just like, well, I guess now they're doing this thing, and so forth. But there are certainly books that need like time to settle afterwards. I definitely agree with that. So yeah, I'll try to record a video for Lat Luda that will hopefully be out later today. I already have the thumbnail, which is helpful, and the editor of the book, who edited 4 Angry Robot books, commented on the video for Gog Magog, which was really nice. Makes me happy if something like that happens. Yes, have a good day, and thanks everyone for hanging out, and thanks Apollo. I'll try to have fun at the gym. I don't think that's the point, but maybe the book will help.